you tell about Glen Hill. Everything you can think of. But starting way back, your darling gentle grandmother and your handsome grandfather. I don't think we want to dwell on his interest in his illness, but Miss Mariah has to come into it and everything. So you tell about Miss Mariah.
Miss Mariah was my grandfather's nurse, and the most charming southern woman ever was. Very positive opinions on everything. And she always used to talk about my sister, Mrs. Bradford, although nobody ever knew who Mrs. Bradford was. But
will this be loud enough to be recorded?
Do you need a microphone?
Yes.
That'll drown everything out. Bye-bye.
I can go for a walk.
Miss Mariah was your grandfather's nurse?
Yeah, he,
I don't think you have to dwell on that.
Well,
Yeah,
my
just wasn't
family.
well. Just wasn't well. Much easier.
he eventually became an alcoholic. He was a very brilliant man.
And his full name was?
James
Davis Windsor.
And were there other James Davis Windsors before him?
He was named after Uncle Jim Davis, who was a Bostonian. And as you know, the family ran a steamship line from Boston to Philadelphia, the old line. And 3 brothers stayed in Boston and 2 came to Philadelphia. That's what got us into Philadelphia.
So the 3 brothers would be James Davis.
And Henry.
There was a Henry Windsor up in Boston too. I can't remember who was there.
Just 2, I think.
Was it?
Just 2.
And down here were William Davis Windsor and James Davis Windsor.
And approximately what year would the 2 have come to Philadelphia?
I would think in the 1870s.
Yeah, all of this is forthcoming.
Yeah.
Upper form.
1870s.
Actually, I have the maps of the waterfront where the Windsor line was in the other room. But that isn't really any great interest in a thing like this. But I'll have all this for you. The actual maps made at the time of Philadelphia. W.D. Windsor and then the Windsor line and so forth and so on. The piers going up, the steamship lines. And then in Maine, you may remember, we have a half-round dune, a half-round of the Saxon, which was one of the Windsor line steamers. That hangs in the main.
Hangs in the hall, yeah.
Saxon. I think there were 8 of them.
Yeah.
And all 8 went around the library in Glen Hill. You know what I mean by half-round models. Not a whole model of a ship,
Oh,
No,
yes,
but just
yes.
the half, and then that's fastened to a plaque.
I didn't realize the significance of that.
Yeah.
So that was the business angle of the Windsor family.
So we had William D. and James D. And then which one are you? You're from the
James D., yeah. William D. was the great family who had a house out here. Well, he had this house, didn't he?
Yeah, he came out. You tell about
Hedgley. All right, I built on it.
About
Give
walking
me a
out from
chance.
town.
Yes, he Hedgley, and he had a house on Delancey Street in town. And he used to walk out even when he was in his late 70s, early 80s from town to see how the property was doing out here, and drink a bottle of whiskey, go call on his relations, and walk back to Philadelphia again, which he'd do regularly. Shot his last moose when he was 82. Toughest old bird you ever saw. He used to take my father hunting and duck shooting and whatnot.
So he made his money in the steamship
The
line?
steamship line, yeah. Then when my grandfather became inactive, Uncle Bill was the one that ran the line, yeah. Then they sold out, and I don't remember when they sold out. But it was enough to start the family off pretty well.
Shall I tell a little bit of history before
Sure.
Uncle Bill had puberty? Let me see. Uncle Bill did live in Philadelphia, as everybody did in those days. Many people had country places out here, including his brother, James D. Windsor, who had already bought Glen Hill, you see, in Haverford. So Uncle Bill thought it would be nice to have a summer place also. So he did walk out from town, as Pop-Pop said. And he looked around Wynwood, and he looked around Haverford, and he looked around all this area to see if he could find a nice place to build his house the way his brother did. And he found St. Mary's area, which is what this used to be called, this Wynwood Ardmore area right here. And he fell in love with this property, which was a farm. In those days, I think it was 60 acres, I believe.
Yeah, included the whole Phillip property
All
over
the way
here.
over
if you
to
look
Glen.
across that.
All the way up to Gypsy Lane.
Do we know who owned it before?
I don't remember the farmer's name.
No.
All she knows that. And he had cattle on it, and he grew everything that you can think of. And he lived in Heathy and Mark's house.
The farmer did.
The farmer did. And even when we came, well, I better not go so fast. He would walk out to look around to see if he could buy something, and he fell in love with this, and he would always come and sit and talk with the farmer. He finally decided to buy it. Now, whether the farmer himself owned it or somebody else owned it, I don't know. But in any event, he did buy it and settled himself here. And there was a house which is the twin, we think, of the tenant house at this end of Heathy's quarters there. And Uncle Hunk can climb up to the third story of his house and squeeze between a chimney and a wall and look down, he claims, on the roof of a 40-foot square house, which is the twin of the one with the Gothic windows, David, right here. You know, that there were two tenant houses, in other words, then on this place. The carriage house, I think, was added probably sometime after Uncle Bill and Aunt Lizzie moved here. It was just the two little houses, you see. And they had pigs and chickens and ducks and horses, of course, and cows, which were here when we came. Pigs, chickens, ducks, sheep in the meadow here in the fall. And they grazed the cattle, cows, and the horses over on the filler property that you can see from here, right on that hillside. Uncle Chris, you remember Uncle Chris yourself?
No,
Oh,
my
okay.
father does.
Yeah. Uncle Chris would take them across the bridge, which was down here by Catherine Nelson's, up the other hill. And Jade has some of the ironwork, I think, from the old fence, which I salvaged. Have you seen it?
Yes, I
Yeah. And he would take them through that fence and turn them loose in the pasture. They'd bring them in at night and so forth and so on. And Uncle Chris was here for 1,000 years.
What year would you imagine that Uncle Bill moved here?
I think he bought the property in 1887. Does that sound right? I think so.
Within 3 or 4 years.
I think about 1887.
And what age might he have been at that time?
Uncle Bill?
Yeah.
He died in
1950.
1920, I think.
And his wife's name was?
Aunt Lizzie. She was the most buck-toothed old babe you ever saw. Terrible high nasal voice. And I was so busy with whenever I saw him with the other aunts and uncles and things, I never saw much of her, but she was...
But Papa reminds me that Aunt Lizzie was a character, as they all were, really.
Oh, everyone, yeah.
And telephones came into fashion right then. And one was installed at Hedgley, and another one in the stable, and another one at the tenant house where the farmer lived, who did all this. And they announced to Aunt Lizzie that this invention had been installed in her house, and that she could pick it up and talk to her stableman, her coachman, anytime she wanted to, so that he would know the schedule for the day. I am not having my coachman breathing in my ear. He will come up to the house and get my orders every morning, if you please. And that was the end of that.
What a character.
My coachman breathing in my ear. They were characters.
Yeah, they were.
Absolute characters. But you will read, I mean, we have diaries and so on, you'll read that Uncle Bill and Aunt Lizzie, they each had horses, beautiful carriage. You've seen the horses, I'm still beautiful. And the Radnor Hunt was, Radnor Hunt Club was just within 6 miles.
Yeah.
Just real regular. And they used to ride out on Sunday mornings. Think of it, no traffic of any kind.
What was Aunt Lizzie's maiden name? What family?
Chapman. And on the piano there's an 1804 Chapman Bible, which I have rewrapped. But it's interesting. Got dates and things.
They didn't give up their horses for years and years. I always went to church with my grandmother in a carriage.
What do you remember about the carriage? Was it
2 horses,
was it open or enclosed?
open, and at the top you could put for bad weather. And
Yeah,
Aunt Lizzie had a carriage too. They all used to.
yeah. And the coachman's name was
John Gallagher.
John Gallagher. And he drove in the
Middle of the road, held up all the traffic. Yeah.
never never to the left or the right, always down the center of the road. James Gallagher was famous,
Yeah.
all over the main line for the way he drove his horses.
Yeah.
Do you remember the horses' names or anything like that? And they fox hunted?
And they
No,
fox hunt.
I don't remember anybody hunting fox.
Oh, well, according to Uncle Bill's diary,
That he did?
he and Lizzie,
Both horses?
both rode.
I never knew that.
Well, you see, you may remember that Uncle Bill kept those wonderful diaries.
Yes, I
that
do
were
remember.
bound so beautiful.
Yeah.
And Windsor Phillips, no more, thank you, John. Windsor Phillips was kind enough to Xerox the section to do the entry.
Yeah.
And Uncle Bill. And that's where that little bit of information came from, was the fact that they used to go out there on Sunday mornings and ride. And often to the hounds.
Besides riding, what do you suppose were their other interests, Lizzie and Uncle?
He?
Well, Uncle Bill was a
Oh,
great sportsman.
shot his last moose when he was 82 years old. He was a duck hunter. Oh, geese and duck.
Did he go out west to do that, or would he have done that around here?
I was around here in Canada. He'd go to shoot the moose.
Yes. And the fishing too, I guess, Canada.
Yeah, so.
Was he the one that's responsible for the moose up in the big house?
Yeah.
Those are all his.
Those are all his heads.
And his father would have been.
No, Boston Winter, and I can't remember.
And his father was Henry.
Henry Winter.
Yeah, his father was Henry. He was a beautiful man. You'll see him hanging when Henry and Josephine move in.
And the Winters settled in Boston what year, Don? Oh, it was way back, 1600.
This is too complicated.
We know the name of the ship they're on, we have that.
I can't remember at the moment.
Yeah.
But
So-
there's still, as a matter of fact, this is interesting. You've seen it. Duxbury, Mass. Is where they lived.
Yeah.
They landed at Plymouth, did they? Which was right nearby. Well, it doesn't matter. But anyway, when you go to Duxbury,
They did land at
Massachusetts,
Plymouth, and they were
I think
just
so.
a ship or two after Mount Standish.
Mhm. The original house of Joshua. Isn't it interesting that Dick Murray, out of the blue, named his child? Isn't it Joshua?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
And Joshua was the first Windsor that came to this country.
Was he?
And when you go to Duxbury, you will find Windsor Lane, which is running down to the water. And on the left-hand side, going down to the water, is Joshua Windsor's original house, which they've preserved. And another one side by side, also Windsor. Maybe one of his sons, I don't know. And there's a Windsor Inn there. Winsor. Oh, Duxbury. Oh, it's a lovely residential town. You'd love that.
Do we know what Joshua did for a living, or why he came, or anything like that?
I did know.
I just go back to knowing he was the direct descendant of Sir William de Windsor,
Mm.
who goes back to Norman times, or William the Conqueror.
What part of England
And it was
would?
Wynsore, the original one.
Huh. What part of England would they have come from?
I suppose we have known, but I don't
Plymouth?
know.
I don't know.
I don't remember.
Do we know much about the Chapman family besides Aunt Lizzie?
Yes, we have tomes and tomes on the Chapman family because Miss T was very much interested in the Chapmans for some reason or another. And she Xeroxed a lot of things, which again we have for you. And a very interesting family it was, too.
Can you remember any of the
I can't remember
highlights?
one single thing about them. Can you? They came from Virginia.
Nathaniel Chapman was quite a famous
Oh,
man.
heavens, yes. Dr. Nathaniel Chapman and Dr. Caspar Wister were the same period.
Yeah.
And that would have been revolutionary. And they were both famous doctors in Philadelphia. And when I'm not sure that my facts are going to be absolutely correct here, but we had the most terrible outbreak of yellow fever in Philadelphia in 1772,
Yeah.
something like that. And most people fled Philadelphia and came out to Germantown, Chestnut Hill, maybe its area, Marion perhaps, to get away from that terrible plague. Dr. Chapman and Dr. Wister, as I remember, and possibly Dr. Benjamin Rush, all stayed in Philadelphia and took care of these poor souls. They were just dying like flies, you see. And so it was interesting that, as I remember, Dr.
Yeah.
Caspar Wister and Dr. Nathaniel Chapman were associated. And here we are together. He descended from Dr. Chapman.
Which Chapman was the beautiful one with the hair that we had?
Well,
Yes,
as long as he's
Bertram
not a
with big
direct ancestor, do you want to bother with him?
Well,
Will
I
it confuse the
wondered.
children?
I thought he was. I
No,
didn't know.
I believe not. He died very,
Best
very
looking,
young.
best looking man I
Oh,
ever saw.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But I believe he died very, very young. No,
Change your mind?
No, thank you, sweetie.
So we have Uncle Bill coming out because he wanted a country place, but he maintained,
House in town.
and then
And I guess at one time my own grandfather had a house in town too. But
They all did.
Yeah.
They all did. Well, I think Susan's trying to get the line straight, aren't you? Joshua, and then on down, and then the next one we know much about is Uncle Bill.
so Uncle Bill's children would have been.
Uncle Bill had 2 daughters,
Mrs. Horace Howard Furnace. She was
Lou.
Aunt Louise, yeah.
So her full
And
maiden
she
name.
became a terrible cripple, but he was the famous Shakespearean scholar. So that's where a lot of the intellect in the family came along those lines.
So her birth name was.
Was Louise Windsor.
Louise, when she was Uncle Bill's daughter, and she married Dr. Furnace.
She was Louise Chapman, I guess, wasn't she?
No, Aunt Lou was Uncle Bill's daughter. Aunt Lou Furnace and
Yeah.
Aunt Filler and Emily Filler
And we
were
call her-
sisters.
So Emily and.
Emily and Aunt Lou were the only children of Uncle Bill Windsor.
That leads to one story about Emily that she used to fight with my Uncle Henry and claim that the rats from his chicken coop were infesting her house. She said no, and the contrary, the rats from his house that were her house that was infesting his chicken coops. They always battled. You couldn't put anything over on Uncle Henry.
Childish
Yeah.
discussions.
Must we
So
talk
the-
about Uncle Henry a little bit while we have him?
Well,
Maybe I
that's,
could
that's
just pursue just for a second. Aunt Lou
Skip.
would have been born more or less when.
Well, she would have been a little bit older than my father, not much. He was born in 1876, so I guess she'd have been born in 1872 or 3.
And she became crippled.
And she had, was it arthritis or cripple somehow?
I don't really know the details of that, no.
And what you say she was very bright. What kinds of things did she do?
Don't know what she did. She was very intellectual.
I mean, would she write letters all over the world, or would she write books, or?
No? But I just, it's awfully hard to remember what the bright Windsors did, but they were bright as hell, every now and one of them.
Loved to read, loved the theater. And of course Shakespeare came in so much into this family because of Uncle Horace, is that his name?
Horace Howard Furnace
Yeah.
was a Shakespearean scholar.
Shakespearean scholar.
For example, my Aunt Mary Windsor, we took her to a new version of Hamlet, and she told us how poor it was, and quoted the parts that had been left out and why they shouldn't have been. That actually was a good experience we had.
There is a large library at the University of Pennsylvania, which is named for your cousin, Horace Howard Furnace.
Yeah.
And I think it has the largest collection of Shakespeare original folios and so forth in this country, I think. Very interesting.
Uncle Bill has the most prominent grave at the Church of the Redeemer. It's right in front of the front door.
Is it Uncle Bill?
Yeah.
It says Chapman on it.
Chapman and Uncle Bill's right alongside.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
And so was it because he had 2 daughters that did he leave this place to George?
So he left.
When they died, my cousin Lou, my father took care of all her affairs, took care of all the family's affairs, and she went to him in gratitude because he never charged a nickel for all the things he did for her.
And that was how this came to be.
That's how it came in our family.
So the property
And
went
he
from.
always called it the curse of his lives. He was preferred much more living right in the railroad tracks at Rosemont than moving down to this place and being bothered with all the problems of gardeners and things.
But Susan asked an intelligent question, which was that Uncle Bill had 2 daughters,
Yeah.
no sons, so she, then his daughter, Aunt Lou, left the property, this section of the property, to George.
And the other
James
section
D.
of the
Windsor
pillars.
Jr. And the other 2 grandsons,
Yeah.
Uncle Bill's grandson, was Mr. Bill Filler, Sr. over here. You see, so that's the way that was fairly divided, he thought.
I see. So then if we go back from George, how many generations from him
You yourself?
Well, we've talked about Bill Windsor, and then if we start on the other brother and go down.
Well, it would be James.
Well, do you do one?
First, second, third, fourth, and fifth.
Oh, you mean Uncle Bill Windsor's brother? You want to talk about?
Yeah. That was James D. Windsor.
Oh, I see. Danielle.
Yeah.
So he
I
came
guess
out
you've
here
already done it.
in similar fashion to his brother, lived
Yeah.
at Glen Hill,
Yeah.
which was right up where Windsor Lane is now.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
On the hill above Windsor Lane.
And how did he make his living?
He was also in the steamship line until he
Came an invalid.
became an invalid, yeah.
And his children, you see.
They always tell me how bright he was, but he was just kind of a pale old vision when I grew up and went there for Sunday lunch. And the aunts and Uncle Henry talked so much you never heard a word out of him.
Oh, poor dear man.
Yeah.
Darling, his children were, we know that there were 5, but which one? Your father was the oldest one?
No, Henry was the
Uncle Henry.
No, Mary was the oldest.
Oh, yeah.
Then Henry, then my father, and then Rebecca, and then Ellen.
And Aunt Ellen, the baby, yes.
Yeah.
Mary's full name would have been.
Mary Windsor, she never married. See, the only ones that married in that family were Aunt Becky, who married an architect by the name of Edmund C. Evans, and George, who married Marion Curtin. Only 2 of the 5 married, so that's easy to remember.
Did Mary have a middle name?
I think she was just Mary Windsor.
I think so.
Yeah, just Mary Windsor.
Rebecca was Rebecca Chapman Windsor, I'm sure of that.
Yeah, she
Ellen,
was
Ellen
beautiful.
Windsor had no middle name.
No.
Henry Windsor had no middle name.
That's right. They did go into their name, did they?
What were some of the things that you both remember about?
Aunt Becky was perfectly beautiful. They were all very outspoken.
Oh boy.
Very, very outspoken. I mean, they called a spade in
Oh,
the right
terribly
time.
interested in politics. Very anti-war.
Mm.
They used to
Pacifists.
tremendous pacifists, all the ants.
Great pacifists.
And
And
very
all
pro-women's
out for
suffrage.
women's rights, yes.
Suffrage.
And Uncle Henry was
Very
a
interested
doctor.
in the poor.
What was
All
it?
interested in the poor, yes.
How did they get so? I mean, if you call them socialists. How did they get exposed to that line of thinking, or why do you think they? What
So
were?
this particular community was tremendous contrast between great poverty and great wealth. And they were for the poverty. Although I don't think they spent much of their money giving it away.
Other than suffragettes and whatnot, what else did they do with their time? I mean, did they garden? Did they have animals?
Loved animals. Many of the animals there, I mean, the dogs buried up there, belonged to, well, I guess they all belonged to Uncle Bill, actually. But the dogs,
Yeah.
in the little graveyard up
I
there.
don't remember any animals except Ponty,
Ponty,
was a spaniel that my grandmother went there on.
yes. But Auntie loved dogs.
Yeah.
Oh, loved dogs. Yes, they were very animal-minded, I would say.
Did the 3 aunts spend much time together? I mean, did they get along
They
well?
fought like mad.
Yeah, but loved each other.
Loved each other.
Yes, in fact, Aunt Ellen finally went and lived with Aunt Becky
Mm.
after her family died, and they left leaving the big house to Uncle Henry up there. And
Well,
Uncle Henry would have been very difficult to live with because he was working on some project or another and had mirrors attached to trees all over the place and shown in. We actually think he was working on penicillin at
We
the
know
time.
he was,
Yeah.
and those who know say he just almost had it. We've
And-
gone into this before with you children, have we, the mold?
And he got very interested in pigeons, particularly the tumblers, and tried to breed them so there'd be nothing but tumblers, but that didn't work out.
Very
Tried to do
impractical man.
selective breeding.
But such a darling, such a darling. He dressed like a tramp, you know. He had all his clothes made to order. Have we bored you with this too?
I'd like to hear it.
Oh. Well, he had all his clothes made to order, but insisted the tailor make everything 2 sizes bigger because he didn't like anything tight on him.
It was enormous pockets.
So, yes, huge pockets, and the shirts were hanging out like this with these initials on them and everything, and the suits were baggy. In fact, I think he turned up the cuffs at the trousers, as I remember. But in any event, in spite of his peculiar appearance, and he really was pretty odd-looking, he was the kind of man who just knew instinctively how to do the nice, kind, and proper thing. So when Pop-Up and I became engaged, Uncle Henry took himself to Haverford Station. Got on the train at Haverford Station, went all the way into Philadelphia, changed to the Reading Railroad, which ran out where I lived in Penn Lynn, and took a train from the Philadelphia area out to the Penn Lynn Station, and we lived about 3/4 of a mile from there. And he walked from the Penn Lynn Station to our house to pay his compliments to my mother because his nephew had become engaged to Mother's daughter. Now that was what Uncle Henry did without anybody suggesting it. I mean, that was what he considered the right and proper and polite and nice thing to do.
The only book
Oh, it
he
was
ever
so
wrote
neighborly.
was called Painful Feet by H. Windsor, M.D., where we recommend standing on the sides of curbstones and rocking back and forth and things of various kinds. But he actually wrote a booklet called Painful Feet.
Was he eccentric or was he
Very
truly
eccentric.
wacky? I mean,
Very
was he up to much
eccentric.
or was he just
Certainly, he
eccentric?
used to take the train in town, and he would always go from the on a regular trek from the from the zoo to
The aquarium
the aquarium to somewhere over in West Philadelphia
on roller skates.
on roller skates. He'd roller skate all through Philadelphia. Eccentric, also. He was eccentric. And he was always trying to do odd things at the zoo, breed animals queer ways to the annoyance of the keepers
Well,
and all that
he
kind
did
of thing.
actually, and there's a tiny little pamphlet on this one. He transferred tuberculosis from fish to animals and back to fish again. Have I
From
got
humans to fish, humans to animals to fish.
That's right.
Yeah,
From humans to animals to fish.
yeah.
That's why he was spending so much time between the zoo and the aquarium. And of course, all the keepers and all the places knew him intimately. And he was always doing, he wasn't playing tricks on them, but he would always pry them with questions that he knew perfectly well they couldn't answer. He was that kind of man.
Incidentally, one great story about him was Uncle Bill Windsor loved to chew tobacco. And Uncle Henry would ride in with him in the train, and always as they got near West Philadelphia, try to work the conversation around, so Uncle Bill would have to say things like Episcopal Hospital. Got a mouthful of tobacco juice, yeah.
Oh, I'm screaming.
Oh, he's a perfect ride of a man, more fun to be with.
Uncle Henry was more funny.
Yeah, and the other thing, well, he used to shave his head. He had no physical pride at all. It was hot, he'd shave his head in summer. And when my sister Marion was getting married, Mother said, "Please, Henry, for once, don't shave your head till after this wedding." So he shaved his head and arrived at the wedding in a red wig. Which, what?
Was he trying to
Mother
his
said,
nose?
"Henry, you damn fool."
It almost sounds as though he's making a mockery of society.
Yes, he did. He did.
Oh, he never conformed.
Absolute individualist, but every damn one of those aunts were individualists. Didn't care what anybody thought, any one of them. Aunt Ellen was the worst dressed woman I think I ever saw next day Aunt Mary.
They all dressed abominably, and they didn't care, but their faces were aristocratic, and they were intelligent, and very, very kind. Although I think they had a very, not sarcastic, but a very, I don't even like the word mean, but their
Critical, I guess.
sense of humor sometimes was very harsh.
But Aunt Mary didn't like people particularly when she went away for the summer, and I can remember going to Edgartown, and she had a special chair that faced the wall because she didn't want to look at the rest of the guests. She'd sit
dining room.
facing the wall of the dining room, yeah.
I tell you, they were strange birds.
But bright and
They
witty.
were dear.
every one of
Oh
them.
my, they loved you how they loved you. But if they didn't like you, you knew it.
Yeah.
What do you remember about the Sunday lunches, Grandma, when you were coming into the family?
I wasn't in on Sunday lunches. I think Papa's referring to Glen
My whole childhood
when he
in
was young.
Glen Hill was just raging arguments. My father was the conservative, and the aunts were radicals, and they'd fight like hell.
So politics maybe was a
Yeah.
prime subject. And then Uncle Kurt was born in,
He was born in 1905,
and you were what, 4 years old?
1908. He was 3 years older, 2 and a half.
Where did he get his interest in music?
Through the ads.
Oh, they were terrible.
They were
interested in
very,
music.
very scholarly when it came to music. They knew their music. They knew their scores. I mean, they would take the scores to the Philadelphia Orchestra and follow when the orchestra played. I mean, that's how really
I was there in despair because I'd never go for any of these things, projects they had to make Uncle Kurt what he is.
Uncle Kurt, of course, graduated from law school, and he was a full-fledged lawyer as well as.
But they tried to, they tried and persuaded him into.
Oh yes, they wanted him to be a conductor. No, not a conductor, a music critic.
Music critic, yeah.
Music critic, right?
Those are two very different fields, law.
Yeah, yes, interesting. Although they say music is so. Well, anyway, tell about. Oh, this is a glorious story. Oh dear, it's the best of all. Now, what is that? Oh well, I've lost it. Maybe it'll come.
Sure.
Oh no, yes, I know. It's Sunday lunch. You mentioned Sunday lunch. Sunday lunch at the big house. George never went to church. You can tell why.
No, it's okay.
Uncle Henry and your father went to church together.
Yes, they went to church as a child. And while they were in there, a tile fell from the roof and landed on the pew between them. And Uncle Henry said, "Jim, I think this is a sign from God that we should never enter a church door again."
That's great. That's great.
So, with that as the lead-up, tell about the Sunday lunch when Nanny returned. Nanny went to church every Sunday morning. Nanny returned from church, came into the dining room for lunch, and said as follows: "Jim, I have just discovered that you and I have no place to be buried." "Oh, don't get excited about that, dear." "Well," she said, "I found this out. And so I right away went and put our names down. And then you tell me."
My father said, "Just buy one grave and dig it deep, place the whole family in on top of me, so in death as in life I can continue to support them." You can see
Don't
we
you
had
love that, David?
quite a family.
I've heard so many stories about him.
I think that is, of all the stories I have ever
Yeah.
heard about your family, that delights me
Yeah.
more than anything. Just kills me.
He was
Oh,
pretty bright,
the
wasn't he?
twinkle in it. Oh, he
Father
was
Bright, you
Oh,
bet he
he
was
was
Phi
brilliant.
Beta Kappa, plus one of Penn's greatest track stars. Had the intercollegiate high jump record for years.
And the biggest
And
heart.
broke the
Oh,
world
excuse me.
record in practice and then dislocated his ankle and couldn't do it. Me.
Can I tell my story about your father and me? I went to town 2 weeks before Christmas, and in my pocketbook was $60 that had been given to Papa at Drexel and Company as a bonus. And my $60 was carefully tucked in my change purse where it shouldn't have been. And off I went to Wanamaker's and I went shopping for Christmas. And I met my darling friend, Aunt Finn as I call her, for lunch. And after lunch I had to make a telephone call, so I went into a telephone booth, took my purse out of my pocketbook, put it beside the telephone, took out the nickel, it was only a nickel then, made the call, put the nickel in the slot, made the call, and walked out of the booth, leaving the $60, mind you, behind the counter. I discovered this after I'd walked for about a quarter of a block from Wanamaker's store, and I dashed back, and of course it had gone. By the time, I cried all the way home. By the time I got home, I guess my face was stained with tears, and I probably looked a wreck. And the first person I saw was Tommy Murray, my beloved Tommy Murray. He and I just loved each other. And of course he was at the garage all the time, in his little room where Jay lives, and Papa and I were living where your mother and father lived. And I said, "Oh, Tommy, the most terrible thing has happened." Miss Sally, there I was, grandmother, Miss Sally. "Oh, Miss Sally, what's happened to you?" And I told him. And I said, "This is the most terrible thing I've ever done in my whole lifetime." Well, that was the end of that conversation. In the morning, I came down to breakfast, and what do you think was at my place at breakfast? An envelope with $60 in it. And on the outside it said, "To my darling daughter from John." Tommy had told me that I had lost him. I thought it was the sweetest thing. And I was never his daughter-in-law, I was always his daughter. Wouldn't have to do
Never
much.
went around with under $100 in his pocket in his whole life.
No.
About bankrupt. I mean, he never did.
Oh, I felt so terrible. And $60 in those days was an awful lot of money. I was going to take care of all my Christmas shopping with that whole family.
Imagine
Now
that.
you go to market, take $60 with you for the day. Terrible.
So he was very generous.
Judge, oh, he had the biggest heart. He really did. He had the biggest heart. He was, well, how would you describe Judge, Tony? I mean, most people, a lot of people were afraid of him.
Yeah.
He was very
Very.
formidable.
Because with his few close friends, he was the most intimate guy I ever saw. And
He was shy.
he was a very selfish, shy man. I mean, he never went away on summer vacations with us. He'd save his vacations to go down to Currituck Sound, duck shooting, or in winter he'd go to Mr. Horatio Lloyd's and, with 4 close friends and play bridge and that kind of thing. But on the other hand, he was kind and generous, and the most liberal man I ever saw with his children, but he never did things with us, except I remember playing a little golf with him on some occasions, and we used to have Rosemont, we had the office of the Rosemont Quoit Association, and he'd come out and patronize us and pitch quoits with Kurt and Tommy Murray and Albert Conway, the gardener. But he didn't do very much with us. I mean,
This is where,
he didn't teach me anything in the way of sports or how to do things.
can I bring Nan into this? Because this is a lovely moment right now. Nanya did everything with her children. She took them west. She rode horseback with them. She took them abroad, time and again,
Yeah.
trips abroad. And even took you out on the golf course to teach you how to play golf. Because she told me that you made a shot and it went ski whiff, as she said. Took somebody in the seat of the pants. I can remember Nan saying this to me. So Nanya was quite a person. Taught them everything and took them away on summer vacations. And George seldom went.
Never.
Never. Think of the funniness.
Yeah.
Think of the funniness.
Was he a serious fellow?
George, great reader. If he was reading, you might just as well, the house could have burned down around him, just like Papa. Great reader and a great bridge player and marvelous with figures. I mean, he could take a column of about 12 figures and all wrapped up and just and there was the answer, and he was never wrong.
But he had a lot of fun. With his close friends, he was just about as intimate as anybody you could imagine.
Oh yes, had a wonderful time.
But didn't have too many friends.
Did he enjoy business?
Loved it. Oh yes, hell yes. He was one of the things. We have a big family document who has it now in recognition of his running the stock exchange during the First World War. He was made head man, keeping the stock exchange open, not on a trading basis. It was allocated deals here and there that had to be done.
I may have to go. Unfortunately, it's
It is 5 minutes to 12.
I'm afraid I'm going.
Oh, isn't that lovely?